All right, take two. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. So, what does the title of this episode mean? Mental junk food. What am I referring to here? Well, let's start with a blunt idea. A shallow population is an easy population to manage, not because people are entirely bad, not because they are incapable, but because distraction is powerful. If you can keep people busy, overwhelmed, constantly reacting, you don't have to control them directly. They'll largely do it themselves. So think about the world you move through every day. Endless scrolling, at least for many people. That's one of the primary pastimes for a lot of modern people in the world. And you get breaking news that isn't really breaking or seemingly important, some outrage that disappears in 24 hours, celebrity drama that feels urgent for no real reason, and then you have like the more important stories that also seem to fade away after 24 hours, especially in this manic news cycle that we're living in, this right wing hellscape, that is America right now. And it's almost like it's designed social noise because a person who is always reacting doesn't really have much time to think. And thinking is where things start to change. There's a reason education, critical thinking, and curiosity have always made people in power a little uncomfortable. Not because knowledge is dangerous on its own, but because a person who asks questions is harder to control, pretty much by their very nature. A person who reads and, more importantly, reads into things deeply, who understands a fair amount of history, who pauses before reacting, that person starts to notice patterns. And once you see patterns, it's hard to unsee them. So instead, what's easier? Well, keep people entertained, keep them emotional, keep them consuming, not creating, not questioning, just consuming. And over time, something subtle happens. Your mental diet changes. You start feeding your mind the same way that fast food feeds your body. You know, quick hits, easy to digest, especially for something called junk food, but not very nourishing ultimately. And, if you transpose that over to the media landscape, well, it looks like a little outrage over here and over there, a little gossip, a little anxiety, repeat. It's a cycle. And I'm not claiming to be above all of this stuff. It'd be a little bit strange because I've been an entertainment writer and stuff like that. And the arts and the entertainment world have always been interlinked. So, ostensibly I'm sort of an artist, like I'm a musician, not a successful musician, but a musician nonetheless. And I've in the past been involved with making visual arts and all that kind of stuff. And I know what it's like to be having mixed feelings about things as a result of that, because ultimately when you're engaged in entertainment, it can seem like you're just distracting people. So not only do I partake in entertainment, but I also still partake in literal junk food, to be honest. In fact, I'm supposed to be on a diet and I'm definitely not sticking to it as well as my doctor would like. And you know what? Maybe I always will have some junk food, especially stuff like pizza. So long as it's there, there's always going to be a temptation. So you might be thinking, well, this Wade guy's a hypocrite then. And maybe so, but I'm also not just thinking about myself here, you know? In fact, my point here is not just to criticize others for their shortcomings, which is easy enough to do. No, my intention is simply to maybe help you think, just like I want this podcast to also make you think and to make me think for that matter. You know, if I can do that, then that's partly what I'm trying to achieve here, and I could say it's successful. In fact, here's an interesting twist. One thing I've learned as an entertainment writer is that surprisingly often, even silly movies and TV shows actually can get people thinking, And not all of those thoughts are stupid, you know? Like some of the episodes that I've written about have some interesting ideas in them. They have some clever twists, and sometimes they, challenge power in some ways and get you to have a revelation, perhaps even about the world. They might make you think of something in a way you never thought of it before. Like I could give examples here, but I think you know what I'm driving at here, and sure, plenty of entertainment is conformist in embarrassing ways, but sometimes content gets people to question the nature of society around them. So I guess my point isn't, you know, to just stop watching all content or stop reading all content, but definitely think about it more and, you know, try to, I guess, guide yourself into stuff that is more thought provoking. It can be good sometimes, at least in certain contexts. And I'm not saying that everything's rotten to the core, of course. If I felt that way, I never would have stayed watching movies or TV shows or whatever. And some things actually withstand scrutiny surprisingly well. And I'm sometimes Mr. Skeptic, so if if the value of a movie is clear to me, well, then I might actually defend it, you know, with a sort of vigor, actually. So I'm not just dismissing every last bit of entertainment as pure trash, but it's it's partly up to you as the viewer to decide how this stuff is going to shape your thinking. I know that sounds strange because I just went over this whole thing where I'm saying that, oh, this stuff is, potentially leading you down the wrong path. And some of it is for sure. But it's partly up to you, the viewer, to ask questions about what it is you're seeing, either on a TV show or a movie, or of course in a news article. There are certain principles that you can apply to assess whether what you're seeing is a valid way of framing things. And it's nonetheless true, though, that if you know enough about the world and about people, you might actually lose confidence in certain ideas, institutions, and whatever. And that can be a troubling thing. So that's why some people they don't want to watch the news and stuff like that because it can be depressing, and especially in dark times like what we're going through right now. And that's why in order to properly, I guess, look at content, whether it's fictional or factual or ostensibly factual, um, I think one of the best ways to do it is not to turn your brain off or whatever, but to try to assess it from a less emotional place, I guess I would say, you know, because if you balance multiple sources, I would say you're going to have a better chance of finding the truth. And of course, some sources are more valid than others, and it's pretty tough. I should make an episode that's just about the sources that I trust. Like I like Mehdi Hassan, for example, when it comes to political content, and of course, when it comes to certain movies and TV shows, I've actually reviewed some valid things, like some really good content on this podcast. So I guess sometimes, you know, having a well balanced approach can be a good thing, and something should be questioned. Skepticism can be a good thing if you're losing confidence in institutions. Some things do not deserve your confidence or respect. And there's a concept called the Dunning Kruger effect that I'm going to throw into this episode here, too. So, the Dunning Kruger effect basically says this: people who know the least often feel the most confident, and that's because they don't yet know enough to see their own flaws in their thinking. See, it's like if you don't know that you're wrong in your thinking, how do you know that you're wrong in your thinking? It's like a it's like a cycle, and it's a dangerous place to be. And I think that's a lot of what we're going through right now. You know, like one of the examples I've given before is the right wing claim that immigrants are taking our jobs, right? Well, for starters, remember in the pandemic there was a pretty deep labor shortage that was pretty regularly talked about, and I saw signs of that locally. There were, you know, a lot of workplaces that were struggling to have people come into work. So logically, if we really were having all of these so-called illegal immigrants coming in to steal all these jobs, well, there wouldn't be as many job vacancies that, that we would be seeing, right? And also, it's it's interesting that they're claiming that these people are stealing all these jobs while simultaneously saying they're all lazy. I mean, you can't really have it both ways. You know what I mean? Like, and of course they're lying by saying that immigrants are all just welfare cheats or something. Because guess what? If you are an undocumented immigrant, if you're a non-citizen, you cannot legally get welfare benefits. And sure enough, welfare fraud is actually pretty rare and shockingly rare if you watch the right wing media outlets who make it seem like it's such a constant thing. So that's just one example of how to read between the lines when it comes to sources. If you actually think about the logical flaws, like the contradictions, I mean, oddly enough, you don't necessarily even need a contradictory news source. You don't need another source that contradicts the the lying one, basically. Like I just said, there are certain contradictions that are pretty easy to get into and assess. And it's a dangerous place to be when there are enough people who seem to have the Dunning Kruger effect, and plenty of them are in positions of power, or, or there are people in the population who have the same thing going on with their brains. They are confident in their beliefs, yet their beliefs are flawed, or just entirely wrong, or they're misinformed. But because they're confident, they don't understand what their flaws are. And, that happens not just individually, but collectively, because when confidence is not grounded in understanding, it becomes easy to manipulate. Now, layer that onto a world filled with constant stimulation. You don't just get misinformation and disinformation, you get overconfidence in misinformation and disinformation. And suddenly, thinking becomes quite optional. And here's the deeper issue: this isn't just about politics or systems or them, although the people who constitute them certainly do matter, but it's also about our habits, because every day you choose what you feed your mind. And there's a simple analogy people keep coming back to: treat your mind like your stomach. If you eat junk food all day, you might feel full, but you're not actually all that nourished, and you might end up feeling ill, actually. And, you know, that's one of the things that can force a person to take a diet, go on a diet. And with the media landscape, if you are feeling like the world is hopeless, well, sometimes you need to find a new source, and it's not always going to be a valid source, but sometimes maybe it will be. it's a bit of a gamble, and some people they just don't know how to decide what is a legitimate source and what is not. So here is my general criteria for what makes something legitimate. I've said this before on the podcast, but it's pretty simple. There are like three little rules I have. So the first one is, does the thing in question does it do what it's supposed to do? In this case, it would be a media source, but it could be like, I don't know, a government program, or uh, a general worldview, like whatever you want to throw in there. And if it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, then it's like false advertising, and you can sense at least some illegitimacy in that. And the second aspect is, does it seem to do more good or more harm? That's another one that can be a little bit tricky to assess. But when it comes to the media landscape, you can ask, well, is the talking head, or the, I guess, TV show host or whatever, is that person coming across like they're sadistic, like they actually want to harm more people than help them? And if you watch Fox News enough, you get the sense that they love violence. They 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 love war. They cheerlead bullying against various minority groups. That sort of thing. Um, they endlessly praise the U.S. Constitution while trashing it. It's like it's like a priority of theirs to just violate some of the core constitutional principles that I was taught in civics class. Like the United States is supposed to separate religion from the government, for example. Well, you're supposed to have freedom of religion. And Trump, of course, at one point, he wanted to ins- install like a Muslim ban in the United States, which is, of course, a very blatant violation of the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. government is not supposed to ban a major religion. That should have been a disqualifying moment in Trump's political career, but it wasn't. And here we are today, you know, right on the brink of perhaps dropping nuclear weapons on Iran. And okay, we get a sense then, I mean, if we're being sane about things, that, well, Fox News and similar media outlets, well, they have some sort of interest in being cruel and causing mass destruction and mass death. So that, to my mind, objectively, seems like they're causing more harm than good in the world. You know, Trump seems to love the idea of, just destroying Iran. It's he's talked about unleashing hell on them and stuff like that. And he said that their civilization is going to be destroyed and all that kind of stuff. So that's like bloodlust. That's just objectively bloodlust at that point. So I don't see legitimacy there. That's not somebody who is concerned about, Iranians or its safety or anything like that. This is somebody who is a warmonger and who is willing to just destroy other countries. And okay, what's the other criteria that I mentioned then? Moving on from that one. Well, is there accountability? So, that's another challenge to assess. But does the media outlet in this case, does the media outlet have a way to be held accountable if they lie or something like that? Would they apologize or uh, put out some corrections if they said something wrong? And sometimes, sure enough, media outlets might do something like that. And, that would be great if they did that more often. But quite often, this also has to do with reading between the lines here, because sometimes news organizations will lie by omission. So, for example, when it comes to the Iran stuff that I was just talking about, the simple fact is that the United States is the only country in world history to have dropped a nuclear weapon on another country. Of course, that was Japan with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So, how often do people actually bring that up? So, very little mention of it. That is true even among leftists who discuss politics. And that's a very strange thing. But in a way, that ends up sort of letting these narratives lie by omission, because that's a major thing to omit. The United States, I mean, if you're a logical person, we should be the last country on the planet that gets to finger wag at other countries regarding their real or imagined seeking of nuclear weapons. And that's because, well, of course, we're hypocrites if we express outrage over such a thing. At practically any other country on earth has more of a right to do that than we do. So, the mediascape is not being held accountable on that point, because they're sort of lying by omission by not mentioning that. And again, it's a major omission. And I feel embarrassed by all these different, or about all these media organizations that fail in that way. There are so many things that they omit over the years. And if you look at the Iraq War, that would be another one. How often did they mention that the United States actually had a long lasting relationship with Saddam Hussein, even supporting him during his worst atrocities, like the Anfal campaign against the Kurds back in the day? Well, that seems like it should be something they should mention a little bit more often, when we were supposedly such mortal foes or whatever. You would think they would mention that the United States actually helped build up Saddam Hussein. Doesn't that kind of augment the situation a little bit? Like, shouldn't that change people's understanding of that whole scenario a little bit? Like, if you helped put somebody into power, and then, you accuse opponents of war of being in in favor of that person who was put in power. um, Well, that's a little bit strange, because the United States put that person in power. You know what I mean? Like, back during the Bush administration, if you were critical of the invasion of Iraq, the attacks of Iraq, and all that, the attacks against Iraq, if you were critical of that, well, then they would say, "Oh, you love Saddam Hussein," or nonsense like that. And it's just the same old argument that if you criticize the Vietnam War, you were suddenly morphed into a communist, even if you weren't a communist. It's something that it's an argument they trot out with every sort of war. And I hope people are finally catching on to that a little bit better. But it seems like we're not. It seems like we're not even now. So, when it comes to being malnourished, that can happen mentally too. You know, I'm trying to cut down on junk food when it comes to literal junk food, but also, you have to try to find valid sources that will help you out mentally and balance your perspective, so you don't have just junk cluttering up your brain. So you can spend hours online taking thousands of pieces of content and still feel empty, or worse, anxious, angry, and disconnected. Maybe you'll just, stop engaging with content altogether, which is actually in some ways just as bad as immersing yourself in endless junk. Now, I'm not saying all content is bad. I want to emphasize that again. I'm not saying distractions are always bad. In fact, I think normal people should be able to take breaks, enjoy some fluff, some entertainment, relax sometimes. Not everyone has that luxury, of course. Some people are directly facing crises in the world, but it's nice if you can have it. And sometimes I think people should be able to, just relax, have a normal day, the kind of stuff it would be nice to take for granted. And here's the part people don't like to admit: a lot of largely empty content is addictive. It's kind of engineered to be. It gives you stimulation without deeper satisfaction. You keep coming back, but you never feel much better. So, what happens? You stop seeking depth. You lose your taste for it. And reading feels slow, thinking feels tiring, silence feels uncomfortable. And you're used to just hearing others do the talking and the thinking and the creating for you. And that's the real cost. It's not just about control, it's not even just mindless manipulation all the time, but disconnection from your own ability to think clearly. But once you start thinking for yourself a little bit more, discover some creative part of yourself, something shifts. If you're a person who creates content in addition to just or instead I mean instead of just having content wash over you, well, it becomes like a whole other thing. And that's why I think, some people are like, oh, there are too many content creators out there. And I do understand that. It seems like they're cluttering they're cluttering the social media and the media scape in general. But in some ways, it can actually be a good thing if it's being used intelligently. And that's a big if. But if you do have that part of yourself that's thinking more for yourself, and you have a creative outlet for your own, uh, not only entertainment but your own intellectual growth, you don't react as quickly, you don't panic as easily, and you don't follow every wave of outrage. You start asking, is this actually important? Who benefits from me believing this? What am I not seeing? And that sort of thing. And that kind of thinking, it can change a lot because it makes you harder to influence, harder to sell to, harder to scare, and it also makes you more independent. And independence doesn't mean isolation. It means you don't need constant validation from a screen or from this or from that. You don't need every opinion handed to you, and you can sit with your own thoughts and trust them more while still being open to changing your mind with new information, and not just when it comforts you, but when the facts merit such a change. And here's the thing: a person who can do that is a little bit more difficult to control, not because they're rebellious so much as because they are aware. So, if there's one idea to take from this, it's actually pretty simple. Pay attention to what you consume, not just food, not just media, but actually everything, because what you consume shapes how you think, and how you think shapes how you live. And if you keep feeding your mind a bunch of noise, a bunch of garbage all the time, you'll start to believe noise and garbage is all there is. But if you start feeding it something real, with depth, knowledge, perspective, and pair it with your own creative pursuits, be they artistic, or if you're suddenly interested in, you know, uh, political commentary or something like that. Well, if you pair real, genuine, deep content with that kind of stuff, that personal, uh, creative sort of thing, then you begin to see a much bigger picture. And once you see that picture, you don't feel such a strong need to go back to junk, you know? And again, I'm not saying that all junk is bad. you know, I also feel the need to emphasize that point. But it can't be all that there is. You need to sometimes take a hard look at the world and the hard content. And no, I don't just mean like edgy, offensive content. I mean stuff that might even be a little bit boring at first in how it's presented, but the factual content is just as important as stuff that's entertaining. So sometimes you have to even put your own boredom aside if something's not, that entertaining for you, and you just have to appreciate the factual elements of what it is that you're engaged with. So maybe the question isn't who's controlling what. Maybe the better question is, what am I choosing to feed my mind today? So I'll leave you with that. I think I've talked enough here. This is actually a half-hour long episode. So yeah, I've got I've got a lot that is said here, and if you like it, feel free to subscribe, click the like button, leave a comment yourself, and try to make it an intelligent comment that reflects the values I tried to lay forth in this very episode. Have a good day.